All right, guys. Today, like I said, we're going to finish up talking about the Mongols, this crazy group of people that killed millions and millions and millions of people. Yet, in the areas they conquered, typically people kind of were prosperous, kind of thrived in. It's kind of a weird dynamic. But we are going to continue to kind of accomplish the learning goal, comparing the positive and negative of what the Mongols were all about. But of course, it's doing weird things because it's the morning, so that's just kind of how it is sometimes. So let me see if I can get this on the right version. There we go. So today we're going to finish that up. I've got 3 pretty cool video clips that go along with everything that we're talking about. Just continue to take good notes. If you did that T-chart yesterday, if you set it up, continue to kind of divide some of the stuff that we're talking about into the good as well as into the bad. And yeah, we'll be done with the Mongols today. Tomorrow we are going to work on our test review. The test review is already posted in Canvas. Part of it's vocabulary. The other half is over some review videos we're going to watch in class tomorrow. It is for its own grade, but all you got to do is definitions over the vocab, because those are things that you will see again, some of which will be on the test. But also, after those review videos, just give me a little summary, a little paragraph that kind of talks about some of the main ideas, because the whole point behind that is to kind of spark your memory and give you a good pathway, a good indication of some of the stuff you need to be studying in preparation for the exam. The test on Thursday, the same day as your exam, the multiple choice exam you're going to do in class all together. It's on Canvas, structurally very similar to our last exam. Most of your questions will be in sets, attached to some sort of stimulus. So maybe it's a primary source document, a secondary source, maybe a map, a chart, a graph, something like that. Just remember, the answers usually aren't just smack dab in there. You've got to evaluate the resource, you got to analyze and interpret it, but then you got to think about what you already know and then draw some conclusions. These sorts of tests, guys, they're weird. Okay, the questions are always worded a little strangely. That is not Mr. Brown being evil. That is the College Board being evil. But considering, this is a College Board class, it's an AP class, and we're trying to get you ready for the AP test at the end of the year, we do have to do activities like that. So the test itself is going to be 30 questions, multiple choice. You have a 45-minute time limit. If you do not finish in time, I'm going to grade whatever you got done. So please, do your best to try to finish on time. And the best way you can prepare is to do your test review and then study your notebooks. So those are 2 grades, 1 daily grade, 1 major grade. The last thing is that extra credit personal progress check quiz on AP Classroom. For every question you get right, I'm going to give you an extra point on one of your test grades. Just keep in mind, it is also timed. It's a 20-minute time limit. I have learned that apparently if you don't submit it, it'll still show that you did it. But if you don't submit it within the time limit, if you let it just run and run and run, I don't really think that's fair. So you need to do it, but you need to get it done within that 20-minute time span. Because part of the reason we're doing it is to just kind of not only get exposed to these weird sorts of questions, but also practice, operating under a time limit. So if you can get it done by Friday before 11:45 and you can get it done within that time limit, submitted within that time limit, you can get the extra credit. Guys, there's nothing to lose, okay? But there could be a lot to gain. Last announcement, AP exam deposit. You're in here. We're doing stuff every day to get ready for this thing. So if you can, I highly encourage you to take the AP exam in May. It is a $44 deposit out of $90 that is due at the end of the month, or if you're eligible for a free reduction. If you have like free or reduced lunch, you probably are eligible. It's only $25 total. Either way, these payments, one or the other, whichever one you kind of qualify for, they are due by Friday the 30th. And you're going to make your payment through the AP, or not the AP, the total registration site. Same spot that you filled out all the information to register, that is going to be the same spot that you need. So that's pretty much it for announcements. Are there any questions regarding any of that stuff? Okay, let's get started. So yesterday we talked about Genghis Khan, Temujin, the ruler of all, the true founder of the Mongol Empire. And it's one of those things, he's a complicated character. We look at his historical legacy. And yesterday we saw some examples of the sheer brutality he was capable of, the cruelty. But also we saw some examples of how he was actually a pretty inspiring and effective ruler. And maybe the legacy of the Mongol conquest wasn't all bad. Again, they revitalized Silk Road trade, they increased cultural diffusion, there was a greater sense of equality, greater sense of tolerance in general. I mean, he was a good ruler, if you managed to survive the conquest. So the first thing we're going to do to kind of wrap up Genghis Khan, because we're going to move to the latter years of the Mongol Empire after this, is we're going to watch a short video. Once again, it's from TED Ed. I like their videos. They're quick to the point. They're usually full of really good information. But this video is entitled History versus Genghis Khan. And we will watch a few more of these history versus videos. The concept of the videos is usually the same. They'll take a historical figure, okay? Like we'll watch the one on Christopher Columbus later on. Somebody who's kind of controversial. And it's almost like that historical figure is on trial. All right, and they'll be the defense attorney, they'll be the prosecutor, and they're going to lay out their case for why this person was either good or they were bad. Again, I think this will be a good review of some of the stuff we talked about, and even kind of get into some of the stuff that we just barely touched on. So pay attention, feel free to take notes if you want, but as long as you stay awake and pay attention, stay off the phone and all that stuff, you will be in good shape. Here we go. First video of the day, we got 3 today, history versus Genghis Khan.
He was one of the most fearsome warlords who ever lived, waging an unstoppable conquest across the Eurasian continent. But was Genghis Khan a vicious barbarian or a unifier who paved the way for the modern world? We'll see in History versus Genghis Khan. Order, order. Now, who's the defendant today?
Remember, kids, all the videos are on the Kansas side.
I see Your Honor is familiar with Genghis Khan, the 13th century warlord whose military campaigns killed millions and left nothing but destruction in their wake. Objection. First of all, it's pronounced Chinggis Khan. Really? In Mongolia, yes. Regardless, he was one of the greatest leaders in human history. Born Temujin, he was left fatherless and destitute as a child, but went on to overcome constant strife to unite warring Mongol clans and forge the greatest empire the world has seen, eventually stretching from the Pacific to Europe's heartland. And what was so great about invasion and slaughter? Northern China lost 2/3 of its population. The Jin dynasty had long harassed the northern tribes, paying them off to fight each other and periodically attacking them. Chinggis Khan wasn't about to suffer the same fate as the last Khan who tried to unite the Mongols, and the demographic change may reflect poor census keeping, not to mention that many peasants were brought into the Khan's army. You can pick apart numbers all you want, but they wiped out entire cities, along with their inhabitants. The Khan preferred enemies to surrender and pay tribute, but he firmly believed in loyalty and diplomatic law. The cities that were massacred were ones that rebelled after surrendering, or killed his ambassadors. His was a strict understanding of justice. Multiple accounts show his army's brutality going beyond justice, ripping unborn children from mothers' wombs, using prisoners as human shields, or moat fillers to support siege engines, taking all women from conquered towns. Enough! How barbaric! Is that really so much worse than other medieval armies? That doesn't excuse Genghis Khan's atrocities, but it does make Chinggis Khan unexceptional for his time rather than some bloodthirsty savage. In fact, after his unification of the tribes abolished bride kidnapping, women in the Mongol ranks had it better than most. They controlled domestic affairs, could divorce their husbands, and were trusted advisors. Temujin remained with his first bride all his life. even raising her possibly illegitimate son as his own. Regardless, Genghis Khan's legacy was a disaster. Up to 40 million killed across Eurasia during his descendants' conquests. 10% of the world's population. That's not even counting casualties from the Black Plague, brought to Europe by the Golden Horde's siege of Kaffa. Surely that wasn't intentional. Actually, when they saw their own troops dying of the plague, they catapulted infected bodies over the city walls. Ugh. The accounts you're referencing were written over 100 years after the fact. How reliable do you think they are? Plus, the survivors reaped the benefits of the empire Genghis Khan founded. Benefits? The Mongol Empire practiced religious tolerance among all subjects. They treated their soldiers well, promoted based on merit rather than birth, established a vast postal system, and enforced universal rule of law, not to mention their contribution to culture. You mean like Hulagu Khan's annihilation of Baghdad, the era's cultural capital? Libraries, hospitals, and palaces burned, irrigation canals buried? Baghdad was unfortunate, but its caliph refused to surrender, and Hulagu was later punished by Berke Khan for the wanton destruction. It wasn't Mongol policy to destroy culture. Usually they saved doctors, scholars, and artisans from conquered places and transferred them throughout their realm, spreading knowledge across the world. What about the devastation of Kievan Rus, leaving its people in the Dark Ages even as the Renaissance spread across Western Europe? Western Europe was hardly peaceful at the time. The stability of Mongol rule made the Silk Road flourish once more, allowing trade and cultural exchange between East and West. And its legacy forged Russia and China from warring princedoms into unified states. In fact, long after the empire, Genghis Khan's descendants could be found among the ruling nobility all over Eurasia. Not surprising that a tyrant would inspire further tyrants. Careful what you call him, you may be related. What? 16 million men today are descended from Genghis Khan. That's 1 in every 200. For every great conqueror, there are...
What do you think about that? 1 in every 200 people are descendants of Genghis Khan. Now, granted, you're going to see more of that in Asia than you will in this side of the world, but still, that is remarkable. But what they're not telling you is this. You got to think how he got, so many descendants. He was a terrible serial rapist, which wasn't uncommon for the time, but still very evil. I mean, when they sacked the city, he was doing more than just murdering people. He had 13, I believe, legitimate children that he claimed, but who really knows how many other, children he had. And then you look at his children's children, and so on and so forth. That's how you get so many descendants of Genghis Khan to this day. Again, I think that definitely puts him in a negative light. It's one of the worst things.
Millions of conquered. Whose stories will survive? And can a leader's historical or cultural significance outweigh the deaths they caused along the way? These are the questions that arise when we put history on trial.
I like these videos. I mean, they do it in kind of a humorous way, but they bring up some good points. Most people in history are not entirely good or entirely bad. You can almost say that for just most people in general. And even a tyrant, even a barbaric, serial killing, serial raping, conqueror like this, he did leave behind some things that could certainly be considered, in general, very much positive. So after the death of Genghis Khan, for a while, the entire empire was ruled by his son Ogadai. But because, frankly, they all had so many children, a clear line of succession was always debatable. There were already, a lot of claimants to the throne. And eventually what happened to kind of keep the peace is you had the empire break into 4 separate parts, or khanates. Now, theoretically, they were all under the leadership of the Great Khan. We'll talk about Kublai Khan here in a second. He was a great Khan. But really, after a while, each one of these khanates kind of sort of did their own thing. They were connected culturally and to some extent politically. But as years passed, they kind of broke further and further apart It's really that splitting of the empire that was the beginning of the end of Mongol rule, which frankly wasn't for all that long. So you've got the Khanates of the Great Khan, which would be Mongolia, parts of Siberia, kind of getting down here into South Asia and Southeast Asia, but the biggest part is China. You've got the Chagatai Khanates and the Il Khanates, which would be the ones that took over, at least for the time, portions of the Middle East, portions of Central Asia, and then you've got the Khanates of the Golden Horde. Those are the groups of Mongols that the Russians, the Proto-Russians, are ultimately going to rebel against in defeat to create their own Russian Empire, which we'll get into probably towards the end of next week. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time on all of them, but we are going to talk about the Khanate of the Great Khan, which essentially was the Chinese Yuan dynasty, or the Yun dynasty. I'll probably pronounce it like 4 different ways. Again, we've talked about how China throughout its history is ruled by a series of dynasties. Well, this is the first foreign dynasty that took over, in that the leaders of the dynasty were not Chinese, they were Mongols. The largest of the new Mongol Khanates was the area of East Asia encompassing Mongolia and China. One of Genghis Khan's grandsons, I would at least have this guy's name down, Kublai Khan, defeated the last remnants of China's Song dynasty. He created the Yuan dynasty in its place, becoming the first foreigner to rule China. Unfortunately, this is something that will happen again later on, especially when we get into China's final dynasty, the Qing dynasty. They're kind of sort of foreign as well. This is the first time that China had a ruling family that wasn't actually Chinese. So the Yuan dynasty, remember that's the Mongol dynasty. Remember who founded it? Kublai Khan, one of the grandsons of Genghis Khan. Probably the second most famous Mongol of all time, I'd say. I'll tell you why here in a second. See, a few people are still writing, so I'm going to take a sip of my water, and then we'll move along. But remember, if I ever move too fast on PowerPoint, and I know a lot of my PowerPoints are just pictures. Some of them do have quite a bit of text. Those are ones, usually they're a little bit older that I created. I think in my older years, I just got kind of to the point I prefer to put pictures and talk about them. But the point is, if I ever move a little fast, guys, this stuff's on Canvas. So if you miss something, you can go back and look it up, and never feel like you got to get down to everything word for word. These are your notes. I am going to check them. I want to see that you took some notes, but exactly what you write is kind of up to you. Sometimes I will strongly suggest certain things, but for the most part, it's kind of up to you what you write and how much you write. Let's talk a little bit about the Yuan dynasty. Again, ruling over what is now China for close to 100 years. Kublai Khan was born a Mongolian, but developed a great fascination with Chinese culture, traditions, and art. Again, he would have grown in the generation, after Genghis Khan had already kind of started his military conquests. And one of the key prizes of those conquests was China. Again, why did they want China? Well, a lot of it had to do with the trade networks. That's where a lot of the Silk Road was actually located. But also, China had always been this wealthier civilization, this more advanced civilization, this more quote unquote civilized civilization that I'm sure a lot of people in the region always kind of looked up to. Remember, China has that reputation of being the middle kingdom, the center of everything. So although Kublai Khan is the one that finally conquered that region in its entirety for the Mongol Empire, he also had a great appreciation for what the Chinese did, what they were able to accomplish. And he became, something akin to a Chinese emperor. He wanted to be that. He wanted his soldiers to marry Chinese women. He wanted to make them a little bit more like the Chinese. So even though he is Mongolian, he very much adopted many Chinese customs, including establishing his own dynasty. And some of this stuff's going to be repetitive because I haven't read it in a while, and I think I'm going to say a lot of stuff that I just said, but I'm going to read it anyway. He encouraged his fellow Mongols to adopt Chinese ways and even adopted the Chinese name Wan for his dynasty. He also claimed the mandate of heaven in ruling China, becoming Emperor of China and the Great Khan of the Mongols all at the same time. Again, he's adopting Chinese characteristics in part to get the citizens to follow him, to get them not to rebel. If he can kind of continue on with some of their cultural traditions, including claiming that, he has the right to rule because the heavens have mandated it, then he's less likely to face rebellion. So part of this was an appreciation for China and its culture, but part of it was also likely strategy. Again, he's the first foreigner to rule over China. He wants to maintain control. So he adopts a lot of these Chinese customs to kind of fit in. Like his grandfather, he instituted a policy of religious tolerance, which inspired groups of Buddhists, Taoists, Christians, and Muslims. He rebuilt the capital of Zhongdu, which had been destroyed by the Mongols in 1215. Eventually, this city becomes Beijing, the modern capital of China. Again, Beijing wasn't always the capital of China. And it had been through other incarnations. Prior to this, even though some of the older maps, you'll still see Beijing, because they want to let you know it's the same place. Previously, it had been known as Zhongdu. So Beijing, as far as what you think of now, really kind of starts with Kublai Khan. With popular reforms, increased trade, economic prosperity, and the protection of the Mongol armies, most Chinese initially enjoyed the rule of the Great Khan. And it seems counterintuitive, and it kind of is, but you got to understand, they've been fighting against the Mongols for years. And now the Mongols have finally taken over. And during the time they were fighting the Mongols, times were tight. People were really struggling. But once the Mongols take over, all of a sudden trade is reinvigorated. People have more jobs. People have more to eat. So he had some support early on. I mean, people were always going to be upset that a foreigner, someone that they culturally view beneath them, is in charge. But at the same time, at least in the early days, he did have some popularity because he was giving them some of the things that they wanted, some of the things that they needed. Now, one of the reasons that Kublai Khan is probably the second most famous Mongol is he was written about extensively by one of history's greatest travelers, a man named Marco Polo. Marco Polo, a merchant from Venice, Italy, journeyed along the Silk Road and visited China in the 1270s when he was only 17. He was astounded at the magnificence of Kublai Khan's court and the technological superiority of the Chinese over the Europeans of his day. He was especially impressed by their use of gunpowder, paper money, and the burning of coal as a source of heat, which no one in Europe was doing at the time. When he returned to Europe 24 years later, he co-wrote a book describing his adventures in China, inspiring future explorers like Christopher Columbus. Legend even has it, remember what I said about legend has it, who really knows if that's true, but legend even has it that he was the first to bring pasta to Italy, pasta having originated in China. So Marco Polo, he's this traveler, he's a merchant, And, this is after the Mongol conquest have kind of solidified control of the Silk Road, so it's a little safer to travel. And even though at this point the Crusades have kind of come and gone, there's still not a whole lot of Europeans that have been very far outside of Europe, especially as far as East Asia. So he travels to China, and he gets there, during the time of the Yuan dynasty. And again, he sees all these things because technologically they're way above where, Europe was at the time. He sees all these things and he starts writing about them. He keeps a journal. He actually, befriends Kublai Khan. They become kind of buddies. He tells Kublai Khan about life in Europe, about Christianity, about their customs, and Kublai Khan and his court kind of do the same thing to Marco Polo. They supposedly get to be good enough friends to where he actually works for Kublai Khan, like as a tax collector, where he would go throughout the Yuan dynasty and collect taxes and kind of act as an ambassador, you know, and kind of bring back news to Kublai Khan about what's going on in the countryside. So he travels back. He's actually thrown in jail, I think, for a little while. I forget what. But he co-writes this book. Now, it takes a while because you don't really get the printing press until about 100, 150 years later. But once the mechanical printing press is invented by Johannes Gutenberg, early 1400s, I would say, the Journeys of Marco Polo is one of the first big popular books that's mass produced. And it's all about travel and adventure and the crazy stuff that he got into. This book is coming out about the same time as Christopher Columbus is growing up. And it's said that, you know, these travelers, because he was one of history's great travelers, much like Ibn Battuta before him, that these travels are one of the things that kind of compelled Christopher Columbus to be an explorer. And we'll get to Columbus. We'll talk about the good and the bad with him as well, because there is a lot of bad. But, you know, that in and of itself is pretty significant. So trade is flourishing. Connections are greater than ever. But sometimes increased connectivity has drawbacks. For example, part of this the Silk Road trade network expanding and Europe getting more directly hooked in and just trade in general flourishing, it's going to allow everything to spread, including pandemics, terrible diseases. Guys, the Black Death, probably the deadliest pandemic in human history, wipes out close to half of the European population, kills millions, you know, throughout Afro-Eurasia. Some say that the Mongols are at least partially responsible for this. Now, they kind of got into it in the video a little bit, but we're going to watch another video that just deals with the Black Death and specifically why it was so impactful in Europe specifically. Because, I mean, this plague, it killed millions elsewhere. But the plague itself, you know, had a presence in Asia, especially prior to that. A version had kind of made it to Eastern Europe much, much earlier, but it had kind of subsided. But now that, you know, Europe is linked back into the trade network, and now that the Mongols have stabilized trade, everything's traveling easier. And because within Western Europe, this is a disease people had no sort of natural immunity to, I mean, guys, to them, it was like the apocalypse. Like I said, close to half the population of Europe. Yeah. So we're going to watch a quick video over the Black Death, and we will start to wrap it up. You do need to know about the Black Death. You need to know that the Mongols, maybe not purposely responsible, although there's
going away a lot.
There's a compelling argument that maybe they did kind of spread it on purpose. But you need to know a little bit about it. Now, there is a positive effect, and I'd like you to write this down. You know, prior to the Black Death, you know, you still had that strict social hierarchy of feudalism in a lot of Europe. You still had serfdom where people didn't have a whole lot of freedom. But because so many people died during the Black Death, that system starts to kind of erode away as people just need workers, you know. So the serfs, you know, they've got more bargaining power. And the whole social order that they once had starts to kind of dissolve because, again, there's just not enough laborers, and you've got to give these people a little bit more rights to draw them to your towns, to draw them to your states. So the after effect of the Black Plague does have some positives, but guys, if you were living through it, it would have been like the end of the world. What? This video is kind of old, so I thought this might happen. Actually, I didn't. I think it's just because I maximized it. We may just have to roll with it like that.
During the middle of the 14th century, plague spread across Europe, killing millions of people. It is estimated that more than 25 million died during the first outbreak, which lasted from about 1347 to 1353. The Black Death, as it was later named, was so devastating that many thought it would destroy the world. A major cause of the disaster was rats. Rats were everywhere in the Middle Ages, even in the homes of the rich and powerful. They were so common that most people paid them little attention. But rats carried a deadly bacteria in their blood, a bacteria that would kill 1 out of every 3 to 4 people in Europe. But how did the bacteria spread from rats to humans?
The fleas suck blood from their hosts, and that's really how the plague was spread. The flea would go from the rats to the humans and back again. That reaction spread the plague even more rapidly as it deposited bacteria. These tiny creatures, pound for pound, must be one of those deadly animals on the planet.
Fleas live on the bodies of animals like rats and feed on their blood. Adult fleas can jump up to 200 times their own length in search of fresh blood. When infected insects make the jump from rats to humans, they carry the plague with them. Once people are infected, they infect others very quickly. Plague had broken out before in East Asia and had gradually spread westward to Europe and North Africa, but had subsided after killing large numbers of people. However, one strain of the disease survived in Mongolia. In the 1200s, Mongol armies conquered city after city in Asia. As they moved across the land, they brought the plague with them from Mongolia to China, and then to the wealthy Black Sea trading city of Kaffa. The Mongols attacked Kaffa in 1347. They fought fiercely, but no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't capture the walled city. Finally, the Mongols thought of a plan. In a primitive form of biological warfare, the Mongols took the bodies of soldiers who had died from the plague and catapulted them over Kaffa's walls. The people of Kaffa fell victim to the plague, and the Mongols took the city. But before they did, a small group of Italian sailors escaped. They fled Kaffa and sailed back to Europe under cover of night. Some of the sailors were already infected from breathing Kaffa's contaminated air. The rats on the ship took care of the rest. Ships like the one from Kaffa carried the Black Death to Mediterranean ports.
When the sailors reached these places, it was as if they had brought evil spirits with them. Every city was poisoned by the contagious pestilence. Men and women died suddenly. While they hugged and kissed us, they were spreading the poison.
The Black Death struck with stunning speed. Within hours, victims developed large, swollen black spots on the skin of their armpits, necks, and thighs. Some gave off an intolerable stench. Others spit or vomited blood. Those who spit blood very rarely recovered. Thousands of people fled the cities for their lives. They left their homes and their loved ones and headed for what they hoped was the safety of the countryside. Many people realized that the spread of the disease had something to do with the movement of people and trade between countries. But leaders who might have taken action had other problems. The church was in upheaval, divided by spiritual crisis and scandal. And England and France, two of Europe's kingdoms, were embroiled in the terrible conflict known as the 100 Years' War. Despite war and plague, it was business as usual for European merchants. Goods and rats from the Middle East kept arriving in European ports, and traders moved across the continent selling their wares. In late 1348, trade across the English Channel brought the Black Death to England. Soon the plague killed about a third of the people in London. Giant emergency burial sites, like this one at the Charterhouse Monastery, were created to handle the dead. Then, as quickly as it came, the plague was gone. But it would return several times until the 18th century.
There's probably two reasons why the Black Death outbreak came to an end. One is that the population that survived had some form of natural immunity to the bacillus. The second is that the rats that were carrying the plague themselves died.
The plague, which had ravaged Europe for 6 years, was over for a while. Gradually, Europeans rebuilt their countries and their lives, but memories of the Black Death still remained, and even today arouse fear and horror around the world.
Pretty scary stuff, and especially, now, with COVID and everything. I mean, just imagine if, in the Black Death has come back. It's been seen a few times, like in Madagascar in a few areas. I mean, obviously medical technology is a lot better now. But if something this deadly had been, kind of spreading right now instead of COVID, I mean, who's to say what the world would look like? Part of it is you got to understand they didn't know what was causing it. It took a while. For a lot of history, guys, people thought that diseases were spread via bad smells. So if it smelled bad, which it certainly would have in European cities, they thought that was part of the deal. These plague doctors, would wear these crazy contraptions. They kind of looks like a bird's beak, but there's like incense and all sorts of herbs and stuff in there to prevent them, theoretically, from breathing this smelly, contaminated air. Again, is that all the Mongols' fault? Probably not. I mean, maybe they launched the plague body over there. Probably did. Maybe they didn't. But, it's really just kind of their actions of facilitating trade that ultimately let this contagion spread as far as it did. So we got to put that in the bad, even though some of that may have been inadvertent. Despite its continuation after the death of Genghis Khan, the Mongol Empire lacked solidarity after his passing. In China, the Yuan dynasty tried and failed to conquer Japan and much of Southeast Asia. These defeats suggested that the Mongols were not as fearsome as once perceived. Mongolian leaders eventually alienated many native Chinese, and a revolt soon followed, overthrowing the Yuan dynasty and founding the Ming dynasty in its place. The Mongols' defeat in China paralleled a general decline in their power elsewhere, and the empire began to shrink. The Golden Horde had lost much of its territory by 1369 to the growing Russian Empire, while Southwest Asian territories were conquered by Muslim Mamluks and later the Ottoman Turks, a group that we will be talking about probably starting on Friday. You look at the legacy of the Mongols. And while there are some positive attributes, there's a lot of death. Deadliest conflict in human history, World War II. And again, you go back even that far, it's hard to get exact counts due to the worldwide nature of the conflict. But you're looking, most conservative estimates say at least 60 million people died in that 6-year span. Maybe at the top end, 85 million, maybe as much as 100 million. Again, it's kind of hard to tell. Now, granted, this is over a much larger time period. You're looking at 100 some odd years, but it's believed that the Mongols killed between 40 and 70 million people. Now, that would include some Mongols that died too, don't get me wrong, but that is an astounding amount of death. And again, you're talking about decreasing the world population. What did they say in one video, like by 10%? That's pretty astounding. And I don't think any army, any sort of force throughout history, before or since, has been that directly responsible for so much mayhem. So our last slide deals with the good and the bad. And hopefully you have some of this stuff down already, but I would definitely write down the things you do not have. So let's talk about the positives. The Pax Mongolica, that was pretty cool. You know, that Mongol peace after they conquered, you know, their empire. A lot of peace and prosperity for many years. There was revitalized trades. The infrastructure was improved. You know, better roads, way more bridges. Within Mongol society, and after the Mongols had conquered their territory, I mean, we talked about all the raping and stuff, so that's not good treatment of women. But after all that was said and done, and especially within Mongol society as well, they had always been, you know, fairly egalitarian. So within the Mongol Empire and the aftermath of the conquest, women were treated more as equal. They had more rights. You, for the first time, had a single international system of law, the Nyasa, which really allowed for centralized power. Again, centralized power, you've got an emperor, you've got a ruler, and the buck stops there. There's obviously other elements of government, but everybody knows where the power is coming from. Decentralized power, decentralized government is like feudalism, where it's just broken up, you know, and maybe you got a king on top, but really power is vested in multiple individuals. Given, you know, the success that the Mongols had, more and more people started to break away from that old school feudal way of doing things and started centralizing their power and really becoming more unified as modern nation states. They attempted to unify the empire linguistically by kind of having a common written language. They developed something called the Uyghur alphabet, which is still in use in Mongolia today. That didn't really work, but, you know, again, tried to. They were really known for tolerance of other religions. People of all races and cultural backgrounds typically treated equally, which in a lot of societies at the time, you do have a lot of discrimination. There's much less so in the Mongol Empire. And with all this connectivity, there was just increased cultural diffusion. We talked about how the Crusades, you know, led to a lot of Middle Eastern ideas, you know, getting into Europe. But with the Mongols, you know, kind of controlling this area and trade being so revitalized, a lot of knowledge just kind of flourished, you know, technology and innovations, you know, from the East moving to the West, and stuff obviously from the West moving to the East. And this is kind of ridiculous, but because the Mongols rode horses all the time, they wore pants. Believe it or not, in some areas, people weren't wearing pants all that much, which I don't know if that's, you know, really a positive. I think it is. But, you know, they did further popularize the wearing of pants because of their kind of nomadic horseback, you know, riding course culture. Obviously, there's negative impact. They conquered a lot of territory, much larger, I should say, than the Roman Empire. They slaughtered millions of people in the process. They, at the very least, helped transmit the Black Death. Was it all their fault? Probably not. But, you know. This isn't so much positive or negative, but the nature of warfare changed. You know, before this, European knights were wearing that heavy armor. Whoa. The bells are messed up. We still got 5 minutes. They do this every once in a while. Anyway, Mongol fighting techniques, they changed the way everybody fought. Before that, you got European knights, they're wearing heavy armor, hanging out in castles. It's not going to work with the Mongols. The Mongols are too quick for these immobilized knights to really kind of use that, you know, to their protection. Walled cities, castles, you know, as the Mongols probably invented the cannon. They were definitely the group that was the first to heavily use it, because you now have this new siege technology that could knock down walls and could break down castles. Guys, you started to see a lot of those basic institutions go away. So again, you look at the positive, the negative, I mean, a lot of it's up to you. For me, they had an impact. They had a very large historical impact. Wasn't really entirely good or bad. We've got, let's see, 2 or 3 minutes, 4 minutes left. I've got one more video I'd like to show. Let me see real quick. You want to take a picture? It's also on Canvas, so you don't have to take a picture. Let me see how long this video is, and I'll decide whether we're going to watch it or not. Again, some people don't pay attention to clocks. I'm sure this will be fixed after this period, but whatever. Let me just see. Yeah, this is 5 minutes, and I'd hate to start it and not be able to finish it. This is on Canvas, the rise and fall of the Mongol Empire. It's more or less review of what we already talked about, but again, I don't want to start it if we cannot finish it. So I will let you guys go here in just a few minutes. Just kind of hang loose. There's a few people wandering the halls because their teachers did not pay attention at the time. But I am one of those kids, so we're going to wait till the right time.
Hey, Mr. Brown.
Yes, sir.
So